Well, we just wanted to welcome everybody to Board Leadership Calgary 2022. My name is Justin Solomilo. I'm from the Alberta Community Development Unit. Also joining me is one of the members from Board Leadership Calgary, Leslie Evans, who's on the call, as well as Phil Chung, who will really be supporting a lot of our tech stuff today. So if you have any challenges, feel free to message him. Thank you so much for joining us online. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge that we are on traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit footsteps who have marked these lands for centuries. Today, I'm joining you from Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And now, for those of you who have not been to a Board Leadership Calgary event, BLC is a learning collaborative. It was formed in 2013 and really organized for affordable and accessible learning opportunities for board members and staff of small and medium nonprofits. We're excited that you're joining us this year. As you know, in the past 2 years, we've done this thing online. We usually are in person, but we do have a number of great webinars in the upcoming weeks. So hopefully you've signed up for all of them. Really a lot of staff and volunteers from a variety of organizations work together to plan this event, including Alberta Culture, the Federation of Calgary Communities, as well as other community nonprofit leaders. Really a special thank you to our sponsors that support our efforts, Service Credit Union and Simple Cloudworks. And thanks to the Friends of the Federation as our fiscal supporter. Just a really quick online housekeeping. Hopefully you can hear us today. If not, maybe check your settings or message Phil or I in the chat. There are some phone-in options as well, and we can send that information to you if you'd like that. We are using automatic captions for the session. So, if you've been on Zoom and there is a button at the bottom that says closed captioning. So if you need to take a look at that, feel free to do that. We will be using our chat box for any questions throughout the presentation. Leslie, Phil, and I will be monitoring that. Just keep in mind, it's a public chat box, so provide your thoughts and comments with that in mind. We're also recording the session today so that you can take a look at it at our Board Leadership Calgary YouTube channel after this. And you will have an evaluation at the end, and we'll give you more info as we get into that part. All right, onto the show here. We're excited to have Paul here with us today. He works with the Federation of Calgary Communities as the Director of Education, supporting board volunteers and their staff on matters related to governance and operations of community nonprofits. He's a born and raised Calgarian and has been working to support community organizations for over 20 years. And he's served in every type of director position for a wide range of boards and has worked as a staff person in community centers from programming through to management. Paul is also an artist with a background in photography and creative writing. He's currently finishing his PhD in English literature and teaches as an instructor for the University of Calgary and will be teaching for Mount Royal this coming winter. So welcome back to Board Leadership Calgary, Paul. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm really, really touched to be joining everybody today. I am excited for our Board Basics 101 conversation, and we are going to get right started. Phil, I'm wondering if you could just do a quick icebreaker poll test for me. Sometimes polls can be sticky, sometimes they're seamless. I'm wondering if you could help me roll poll number 1 and see how people receive that. How are you this morning? I may have had a few people in mind around my slippers comment. Awesome. Just a quick icebreaker, ready to go, bring it on. Still sleepy, need caffeine. Well, a few of us who are probably fine with our footwear. I'm kind of all three right now, so we'll have to see how that goes. All right, thank you so much, Phil. I just wanted to see how the polls are working. Could you please really quickly run poll number 2 for me, Phil? I would appreciate that. So a question, how new are you to board work? So brand new to it, a little bit of experience. Maybe we're seasoned, maybe we've been around a while, but we're looking for a refresher. I just kind of want to gauge the audience. Oh, interesting. It's a really great split. So about a third of us are brand new, or maybe a little bit more seasoned. Okay, awesome. This is a really great, I mean, this is a perfect split. So Board Basics 101, thank you, Phil. That helps give me a good gauge on the fact that we're all kind of coming at this from, well, a slightly different angle. And yet, whether we do these kinds of workshops for people who are brand new to their board, I mean, I did this a month ago with someone who was 1 week into the job, or, you know, I've worked with presidents around these kinds of conversations who've been in the gig for 10 or more years, right? So really great to understand where we're coming from. I'm going to share my screen now and we're going to get right started. And I've got my PowerPoint. Sorry, folks, just trying to, I should have shared screen first. Oh, Phil, I'm trying to share screen. There we go. There we are. Now I see it. Okay, so can you see my tech problems in real time? Oh my goodness, so funny. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to choose the right side here. Sorry, folks, bear with me. Okay, good, awesome. I think that worked. Can everybody see my presentation? Are we good? Okay, so getting started, Board Basics 101 for Board Leadership Calgary. I will note, just as I get in here, that we did receive questions on things that you're particularly interested in this topic. Some people have questions on, oh, I'm just looking for a governance refresher. Some people are looking for ideas around recruitment. I mean, maybe you've joined the board, but you're also interested in how other people get engaged as well. We did have some very niche questions, and I want to just sort of make a quick plug for Board Leadership Calgary. In a couple of weeks, the session for BLC is on fund development, and in a month's time around strategic planning and strategic work as well. At the last slide of this presentation today, I also have my email and my phone number. So if there are things that you came today that you really wanted answers on, please don't hesitate to reach out if we don't get to them. But Board Basics, as a bit of an umbrella conversation, really does wrap around so many of the different kinds of things that brought you here today. So for today, our participant goals, we really are looking at developing kind of a broad knowledge around general roles and responsibilities for boards. Sometimes the folks who come to these sessions are paid staff as well, who are coming to support their boards. So really anybody who's here today will cover topics that are applicable to you. Being able to identify common elements of general nonprofit frameworks. At the Federation of Calgary Communities, we work with so many different nonprofits. Some are multi-million-dollar arenas. Some are 5-person startups, grassroots community volunteer groups looking to engage their community. It kind of doesn't matter when it comes to board responsibility about the core fundamental principles of how organizations form and function. The difference is scalability. The bigger we build out our work, our infrastructure, our empire, if you will, the more responsibility we take on. But the principles are essentially the same. And so that's why it's so important to talk about the framework. Ability to plan and prepare for effective board meetings. I don't talk a whole lot about this, but I mean, we are board members, we are engaging in a volunteer capacity. It is important not to miss the sort of key piece around the importance of meeting and what brings us together. And then recognizing some common challenges and positives. I do want to note that, you know, common challenges, maybe not something to heavily emphasize on the very beginning of a conversation about board basics, but definitely some things to keep mindful of. Okay, there's definitely some commonality out there, and I wanted to end on positives. We've done some interesting work in that area, so I'm going to move forward. So when it comes to board governance and roles and responsibilities, at a very high level, very sort of almost philosophical, if you will, it's interesting to sort of frame the conversation around the difference between governance as sort of a leadership role where we're thinking about, okay, what does it mean to steer this ship, right? Management in terms of, okay, what does it mean to actually get into some of the more operational nitty-gritty work? management oversight is what I meant, directing activities and resources. And then operational, okay? What does it mean to be more hands-on, more of a working board? We work with nonprofits every single day who inhabit all sorts of different pieces of this. We work with governance boards who are more hands-off. That is some questions that people submitted in advance of today. And we also work with groups who are more operational or direct working boards. Again, as I spoke to that 5-person grassroots startup as well. I would suggest, for at least in my experience, and I've been doing this since about 2010, a lot of the work that we do with volunteer-led organizations are more in the middle space. By middle here, I don't mean the gray box of management. I mean hybrid boards, right? Boards that are volunteer-led, but have maybe a medium-sized capacity where we've got a little bit more volunteers that we're working with through committee structure, maybe staff that we employ, and working committees that see us sort of rolling up our sleeves and actually involved in some of the day-to-day business as well. Boards come in all shapes and sizes, but we see a lot of sort of hybrid work coming out of the voluntary sector with the groups that we serve. So, how to think a little bit about how we frame this. And this is the thing where I take a bit of a pause, and I apologize to you in advance because it's a Saturday morning and it's very difficult to not talk about legal liability in the volunteer roles that we step into, and the fact that that can be a little heavy-handed. So I appreciate your patience, but we have to talk about what that liability looks like in order to move on to some of the bigger picture stuff and how we put it all in context, okay? So boards of directors are legally liable on behalf of all of the nonprofit work for your association. And because of that, it's really, really crucial that boards understand what particularly you are responsible for, but then how. How are you responsible? Do you delegate? Do you have a broader team that you share responsibility with? How do you think about the way that you divvy up the work? We all know that old adage, many hands make light work, but how do we sort of figure out that if the board retains legal liability for all of the work of the association, then we have to be mindful about the way that we delegate tasks, dedicate resources, bring in people, volunteer or staff, okay? So directors are the guiding minds of the association, whether you're a governance board and you're potentially more in the strategic direction setting sort of oversight position of your nonprofit, or whether you're very, very directly involved in day-to-day work. Because of that legal liability piece, boards are then obligated to use authority, okay? So I don't like the idea of mini government or that language, that kind of all of the baggage that comes with that. But boards are elected. You know, we the people have elected you. We trust you to govern this thing. So go forth, do your work, and then report back to us. And so part of that is your ability to work within that scope of authority that you've signed up for in terms of understanding the oversight of your association. And then to manage the organization's affairs. Manage is in quotes here. It varies, right? It changes. It doesn't mean you're necessarily deeply engaged in direct managerial oversight. I don't mean to suggest that. But if the buck stops with the board, then we kind of need to remember and not lose focus on the fact that the board then has sort of that ownership over understanding what it is that you're managing, whether you're a multi-million-dollar arena or, 10 board members with 1 part-time employee, right? The buck stops with the board. So how do we think about putting that in context? And so that's what a lot of today is going to be very much focused on. Okay, a framework, if you will. I spoke earlier about the idea that from the multi-million-dollar arena down to the 5-person grassroots startup, we all have similar principles. I'm going to share a framework for you. I do have an arts background, well, nonprofit management on this side, and then an arts background on this side. I like visual models. This diagram is not perfect, and there's other ways of configuring it, but I just want to quickly work through why some of these common principles are so foundational. A triangle, if you will. Your group goes forward and you incorporate. The vast majority of groups that we work with are incorporated under the Societies Act of Alberta. We do work with some groups who are under different legislative streams, but you build your framework, not pretending that the triangle is bylaws, but a framework, if you will. How do you form and function? Within that framework, the board are designated as the utmost and fundamentally in charge of all legal liability on behalf of the organization. I think this is really important because when we join our team, whether we've been on the site for a week, or maybe whether we've been a president for 10 years and we're trying to recruit people in, the board of directors are legally liable as one unit. So whether there's 5 of you or there's 20 of you, I once worked with a board who had 27 people. that is a very large group of volunteers sitting in this sort of unit of the legally liable governing body. But boards are liable as a team. And so as we join our organizations and we think about the people who are involved in helping us run this thing, it's important to sort of remember who is fundamentally in charge. So regardless of the nature of your programs and services and the scope of what you do, and regardless of who you outsource to support the work of the association, it's important to remember the sort of tip of this red triangle thing, this idea of legal liability being retained by the sort of the top boss sort of position. And this does become important, especially if you have an executive director who's been there for 20 years and you've just joined the team as a volunteer and you've been there for a week and you're thinking, well, I'm just a volunteer. And maybe my ED of 20 years knows exactly how things are done around here. Well, this is the language that the Federation is constantly trying to work with people around is you're not actually just the volunteer, you're the volunteers. Because by virtue of ending up on the board, whether elected at the annual general meeting, or maybe there was a vacancy and you were appointed midterm throughout the year, by virtue of ending up on the board, you've ended up in that unit. Okay, that cohesive team of people who are legally liable as a whole. So whether it's 5 people or that board I talked about who are 27, the board is liable as a team. So when you have your staff person who's been there for quite a long time, whether you have a few working committees that you delegate tasks to, it's the board who have to take ownership over all of the work. And so reporting structures and understanding oversight becomes really, really key. These bottom 2 levels are more of a philosophical thing that I just want to plant a seed with you for today. In your constitutions, in your bylaws at the structural level, all nonprofit organizations are fundamentally accountable back to their membership base, okay? It's the voting members who join your association who have an ability to dictate the business that is approved, the financials that you are presenting, the ability to elect to board positions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we know that. If we're here today, then we've joined our boards and we understand sort of maybe some of those basic principles around membership. One of the things I find so interesting, though, is all of our nonprofits, by and large, are engaging the public. And we often have a huge amount of people who are engaging us through a participant kind of base. Public people who come and go, who engage in all sorts of different kinds of programs and services and offerings and things that we put out there for our public. But are your participating base the priority? Or do you understand how that's different from the actual voting membership pool who actually have a say in association matters by virtue of their vote and their ability to engage you in meaningful membership-driven ways and to even become future board members, okay? So we do a lot of work with public nonprofits who sometimes, I'm not casting judgment, but sometimes lose some of the context perhaps between the difference of, oh yeah, all these people love what we do participation-wise, but is that reflected in your member base? I once did a membership recruitment training session with a really vibrant, thriving center who were very proud of the fact that they have thousands of people coming in and out of their doors every month. And when it came down to their voting membership base, they had like 30 voting members. And again, I wasn't there to cast judgment. They brought those numbers to me. And so we had to have a very meaningful conversation around the split between who values you and uses what programs and services and offers you put out there, in contrast with, well, who actually has a voting stake in the association? Okay, some of the folks who sent questions in advance of today had questions around compliance and some of the major things to pay attention to. This is not a governance compliance workshop. This is a board basics, but there's 4 very major corners that are really important to be mindful of. the legislative stream under which you are incorporated, your obligations to the Canada Revenue Agency by virtue of your filings and the different kinds of standards that you have to comply with. It is different for registered charities. Maybe if we have time later on, we can get into a conversation about that. But fundamentally speaking, our nonprofits in our networks are incorporated nonprofits under their legislative stream. I would hazard a guess that about 98%, 99% of our groups are under Societies Act legislation. A handful of our groups go to the federal government and register as incorporated charities with the Canada Revenue Agency for the federal government. Okay. Compliance with the CRA for registered charities is a little bit more complicated than independent nonprofits who are under the Societies Act or other legislative provincial streams who don't have the same obligations to the CRA by virtue of charitable law. I'm not planning to get into the nitty-gritty of charitable compliance today, but I will also hang out after the session if people have questions, or you can email me if you'd like more information. Charitable compliance can be quite complicated. So these are the four corners of compliance: your legislative stream, your CRA obligations. I like to think of this idea of assets, lodging, land. Where do you hang your hat? At the end of the day, whose facility are you in? What kinds of I don't know, subtenant agreements do you have? Are you the head lease on your own land? Do you have a facility that you manage? Do you rent space from somewhere? What kind of relationship do you enter into by virtue of the fact that you have some kind of space or place that you potentially program out of? Or as we know from, literally there's tens of thousands of incorporated nonprofits under the Societies Act of Alberta alone. Just the Societies Act, not taking into consideration all of the other legislative streams. So a lot of our groups do not have physical infrastructure, but this becomes one of those things, right? Compliance is complicated because the more you take on, the more you're obligated to oversee and understand stewardship. And then the fourth kind of corner is to safeguard the association. And so I put insurance in this, okay? So this is something that we'll kind of get into. I'm gonna work through fiduciary duties in a more specific sort of mindful way here. But because the board are legally liable, the board also has a responsibility to safeguard the association. And so making sure that you're not putting the organization at risk, even at a basic level, like making sure that you have proper general liability insurance, potentially directors and officers insurance coverage as well. These are the kinds of different pieces that you should have in place in terms of responsible governance. Okay, for today's presentation, some of the slides we cover are kind of lightning fast. Arguably, I could spend 3 hours with this diagram. I promise you I will not, but this is probably one of the slides in today's presentation that I usually dwell on the most. The one piece I really wanted to emphasize before I move forward is down here. If we are fundamentally accountable to our voting membership base, the members aren't the bottom. I just put them down here because they're foundational, okay? The buck stops with the board in terms of governance responsibility, but you are fundamentally accountable back to your membership base. The reason I'm dwelling on this is because what the members don't know, the members don't know. So even though the board has a responsibility towards healthy governance and understanding the scope of what you've taken on, making sure that you're monitoring these sort of different corners of compliance, which folks, to be totally blunt, this is a wild oversimplification of compliance, which has like 101 plus things on it. But in many ways, governance then becomes ethical, okay? Because the public doesn't necessarily know what's going on behind the curtain. And so because of that, even though there's some very real bottom line legal liability that comes with becoming the volunteers in the governance position and not just a volunteer, we also need to think about sort of the ethical implication on what it means to take care of the organizations that we have signed up to help lead. Because again, what the members don't know, the members don't know. So the red tip of the triangle, that very top of the model, the board is liable by virtue of the fact that appearing on the board, you inherit fiduciary duties. And so what are those? There's 3. Now, care and loyalty, if you Google them, care and loyalty are basically branded as such. You can find all sorts of literature and information out there around the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. The third one, this is a common way to refer to it. I do see it from time to time in different, in different literatures and different research out there around the sort of space of the duty to act within your scope of authority. I have seen it worded in different kinds of ways, but we're going to quickly look at, well, what does the duty of care look like? What does the duty of loyalty look like? And what does the duty of authority look like? Keeping in mind that I use the duty to act within your scope of authority as sort of the common way that these things are worded. So duty of care. Very simply put, it's to do your homework, folks. It's to be prudent, right? It's to care for the work of the association because you've signed up and you're not just a volunteer, you're part of the team who are the volunteers. And so to tend to the work and be thorough. So to make consistent and dedicated effort, to make informed decisions, to follow through on things. You'll see, well, and we will take a few pauses here and there throughout the presentation today, but if we think about this idea of the red triangle, legally liable team governing and sort of the ethical responsibility to make sure that we're tending to the work of our organizations, but also not putting it at risk, then every nuts and bolt question that you might have around, well, how long should we circulate a board meeting agenda in advance? How do we hire the right person for the right job? How do we structure committees, and should we have board oversight chairing committees? Every one of those questions comes back to the fact, well, if you're taking care of the organization and you're asking these questions, then you're probably asking the questions because maybe in your heart of hearts, you know the answer to that, which is if we're going to come to a board meeting and make informed decisions and actively participate in, decision-making processes and votes, then we probably need more time, not less. Okay, Paul, we don't have time. We're super busy. Well, then make time, perhaps. Or how do we hire the right person for the right job? Well, do we understand the scope of that work? Do we understand the need to bring certain kinds of folks into certain kinds of roles with skill sets based on the fact that the board is requiring assistance in carrying some of these things out? Are we thinking about that? One of the things that I find, some of my colleagues find at the Federation, is that, and I've actually found this in my own board experience as well, we're so busy to get on with it. Welcome to the team. We have a lot to do. Let's motor right on forward. Well, there is a responsibility to make sure that if governance is ethical, if we're concerned about taking care of our organizations, and we recognize that, yeah, it actually does take time and resources to just pause for a moment and make sure we don't miss a board orientation, or that we understand that people have enough time to actively participate in meaningful ways, it's good not to rush. It's good not to rush. Okay, there's 3 fiduciary duties. Slide 2 for each one of these 3 is, well, what does this look like in pragmatic terms? What does this look like in action? And after the 3 fiduciary duties, I'm going to pause and then I'll open it up for questions. So in practice, well, this really is about attendance and participation in so many different kinds of ways, right? Well, board members should be attending meetings. We should know what's going on. We should also be able and empowered to actively participate. So again, that volunteer who's been on site for 1 week has as much ownership over understanding how to make meaningful contributions in the board meeting space with the documents provided them, being able to ask questions, as does the president, who they are sitting right beside, who maybe has been there for 10 years. Okay, so when it comes down to personality dynamics and, oh, thanks for joining our team. We know you're new. You'll learn as you go. We got this. We've been here a while. Well, that's fair. We see that a lot. I've joined the board that says that to me. But at the end of the day, because the board is liable as a team, there should be a more of a democratizing space for everybody to feel like they're able to actively participate, ask questions, and understand that the board meeting itself is also a space for debate. And that space for debate can be respectful. That debate can and should in some cases be expected based on the nature of the conversation. And that potential disagreement on things isn't a negative. It's how we look at it, right? So part of this duty of care is to say, well, welcome to the team. Let's not rush. Let's be prudent. And so this is that sort of third principle, right? We tend to the work with care and with thoroughness. One of the things that Leslie Evans, our executive director at the Federation of Calgary Communities, and myself often say to groups who feel maybe burdened by a situation or unclear about how to navigate a difficult or challenging situation. As a volunteer, keeping in mind that people volunteer because we care and we're passionate, so sometimes emotions are very much central to how we're responding to something. One of the things Leslie and I have often said to groups is, well, volunteers, I mean, what would you do in this situation if this was your paid position? You know, if you were facing the same situation as an employee and you understood your rights as an employee and your responsibility to make decisions in an informed way, how would you deal with this? What logically would shake out for you? And 9 times out of 10, I mean, that's a bit of a fake number. I'm making up that ratio. But by and large, the vast majority of people we find, something clicks. And they're like, oh my goodness, I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't respond this way, or I wouldn't rush this way. We once took a phone call from somebody who was engaged in, let's call it bad mouthing, where they were having a frustrating experience with somebody else and they were exchanging words on social media. And we asked that person what they did for a living, and their answer was they were a lawyer. And we said, do you think behaving this way in public channels is appropriate? As a lawyer, what kind of advice would you give to that person? They instantly saw it. Okay, so not to suggest that everything's a crisis here, but again, what does carefulness look like? What does not rushing and being perhaps a little bit more thorough look like? The duty of loyalty, quite simply put, is to put the interests of the association ahead of the interests of the individual. Okay, if the board is well, it's not if the board is liable as a team. Okay, I did apologize to you in advance for using legally heavy-handed language on a Saturday morning, but because the board is liable as a team, it's the board working as a team within the context of decision-making processes that are designed and intended and there to be used democratically, right? We come together, we vote on the thing, the vote and the outcome is what we all stand by, because that is the process that enabled the business to move forward, or the business not to move forward, quite frankly. And the interests of the association come before the personal agenda. So that's where the duty of loyalty really kind of kicks in, is to act honestly and to avoid conflict of interest. There are so many other things that come in here, but I'm just covering the rudimentaries today, okay? So acting honestly, avoiding conflict of interest, understanding that we're here for the organization, even though we signed up for a reason. So we've joined our organization and we have our entry point. We know why we're here, but it's the association we're in service to, not to push our agenda forward. I say that with kindness, okay? I don't say that to cast judgment, but we do know that people join our organizations for all sorts of different kinds of reasons. So in so many ways, this idea of shared liability becomes that, that grounding space again, where, okay, we're all in this together. And so that's something that I will speak to in a little bit. So what does this look like in practice? Well, I mean, right off the bat, conflict of interest is a very interesting sort of space to talk about, okay? Conflict of interest, that idea that, okay, well, if governance is ethical, again, governance has legal bottom lines to it. So I don't mean to ever cloud that matter. Governance has legal bottom lines. But coming back to that principle, especially in the triangle, where the members don't know what the members don't know, then the idea of healthy governance and avoiding things that could potentially be viewed as a conflict of interest, or even have the optics of a conflict of interest as potentially damaging to the reputation of the organization, is something that should be discussed, right? So if I join a board and we're hiring and my spouse is the perfect staff person for that position because they've been doing that job for 20 years elsewhere and they want to join our organization, there might be some crossed wires here if I'm on the board and my spouse wants to become an employee, right? That could have some very practical, pragmatic, very real conflict of interest kinds of challenges to it. We do see these things out there, okay? Community, volunteer-led, nonprofit organizations, at least in our experience, are by default often networked people. I mean, not all, I don't mean to overgeneralize, but folks who are interested in supporting the voluntary sector are often, interested in joining an organization because they have a neighbor, a friend, a family member, a spouse, and somebody who has told them, hey, this is a great opportunity, you should get involved. We do see people coming out of the woodwork to join nonprofits for all sorts of reasons, and networking and connectivity is often a part of the sector. So I don't want to rain on that parade, but let's keep in mind that the optics of the toxicity that comes with crossed wires or conflict of interest, or the optics of something that is uncomfortable, are things to avoid, okay? Another piece, it's one of my favorites. We have our board meeting, we have the conversation. I'm gonna make up a name. JD, I'm just making this up. JD is not a real person. JD and I do not agree at all. Okay, maybe this is our first year together. We only met because we joined the board. I don't know JD. JD doesn't know me. We don't agree. Okay, we always vote differently. The board meeting itself is the democratic space. If you've accomplished quorum, which means the meeting can proceed as a duly constituted meeting of the board, which means you have quorum, you can proceed, all business can be carried out. That is the parameter. Can't see myself on camera right now. I don't know what my hands look like. That enclosed space, yes, the board meeting was enabled to carry forward. We were able to debate, talk it out, hash it out, disagree. We have to stand by the vote as it carries out. So if JD and I voted differently, at the end of the day, we have to represent the outcome. Okay, and so I have a slide later that will crystallize this even further. This confidentiality piece to me is I'm just going to call it, I'm going to use the word fun. It's maybe fun's not the right word, but I say that because we all know that in theory, like, the best conversations happen in the parking lot after the board meeting. I mean, come on. We've had our board meeting, we've had our votes, we've had our conversations. I mean, let's not pretend there isn't some chitter chatter happening like outside later on or in someone's house, right? So this idea of confidentiality is also to respect the process and understand that some things should not be disclosed. Sometimes some of the votes are based on highly sensitive conversations, especially when dealing with personnel, staff, behavioral conduct related to other people. There are spaces and places and times and appropriate ways of having more difficult conversations, and we need to respect parameters and boundaries around that. Okay, I mentioned that sometimes the title of this can change, but by and large, I see scope of authority quite common. So this is fairly simple. This is we the people have elected you, the board. You go forth, you do your great work. We trust you, report back to us later. Okay? And with that, again, it's not micro-government. I said I don't really like the idea of micro-government, but we the people have elected you, go forth, do your work, and tell us about it later. Well, this means that you then have responsibility to govern your association, understanding that we the people don't micromanage you, right? You're responsible back to the membership, but we trust you to carry it forward. And so there are some different kinds of ways that this plays out. It's the board's right and ability and responsibility to exercise power and obedience to the association, and also to uphold rules and regulations. Pragmatically, it carries out in some very specific ways often. These are commonalities. So really, to delegate tasks and to dedicate resources. So this comes back to the triangle. We, the board, are in our red, legally liable unit hat zone. We're up here at the top. We can't do it all. We need to share the load, right? And so there's all sorts of different ways that nonprofits build out their frameworks in order to, again, delegate tasks, dedicate resources. Some common ways, they're not slides on today's presentation, but some common ways. Formalized or informal committee structures that the board can populate with volunteers. Ideally, if not more often than not, designate a board chairperson to join that group at the committee level in order to carry out some of the worker bee functions, keeping in mind that just because committees are struck does not necessarily mean that they can go rogue and do work, because they're just doing the labor in order to support what the board's delegation was. Also, just a little caveat, I don't mean to confuse the language of like an executive committee. So president, vice president, or chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, sometimes a past president. That language that comes with the executive committee structure is often something that by default comes with certain key positions at your board level. We do see groups who have bylaws that specify, executive committee powers. But what I'm talking about right now is some of that looser stuff, the standing committees. Oh, we need a fund development committee. We need an HR committee. We need a grant writing committee. We need a programs and services or membership recruitment, okay? Committees can also be ad hoc, right? Groups that are thrown together in order to accomplish a project or goal, and go out there, do the work, and then help us move that forward. Another part of that's dedication of resources or delegation of tasks may be, hiring personnel, right? And how does that kind of sort of management of your employees kind of look like, right? Whether you have one part-time staff person or one executive director who has 50 employees beneath them, right? The larger your staffing sort of staffing framework and model builds out, the more we encourage you have checks and balances in place in order to mitigate risk based on supervision, okay? If you have 4 rock star employees, that's great, but you don't want 15 board members who all feel they have sort of a free-for-all access to employees at all times. This becomes chaotic, okay? Really important to kind of think of a funneling system where you can designate responsibility at the board level of oversight over your staff.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in. I've been trying to find a hole. So as you pause, I'm jumping in. I've got a couple of questions here that I think, we need to kind of dig into a little bit. One of the questions is, and this goes back to that kind of the responsibility of the board. How do you get board members to learn all of this if they're too busy? And what this means is they believe they're just volunteers and they'll do it when they have time. And so going back to the fiduciary duty, what you're talking about here,
yeah.
How do we actually get them to take their volunteer role seriously?
Thank you, Leslie, and please do interrupt at any time. I don't mean to answer this in a way that sounds like I'm downplaying anything, okay? But at the end of the day, and we're going to look at this in this presentation, it's about what kinds of guiding tools you have in written form that help regulate your work. And I say this because we don't see a lot of organizations who have policy around clarification on fiduciary language. What we see are job descriptions, a board orientation manual that says, every 6 months, every 12 months, we review the bylaws and our subsequent policies. Pieces in place that help the organization understand how they steer the ship, because at the end of the day, effective governance usually has a framework that offers clarification so that we're not making it up in the dark. And I say that because all of this sort of high-level legalese, again, not stuff we see, framed and mounted to a facility wall or clarified in policy. We see these things regulated through the ways that they carry out in pragmatic ways through your bylaws, your policies, your procedures, your HR employment agreements. Like, this is where these things come into place. Another, at least in terms of how I see them play out, and Leslie, you can add to that if you want clarification on that. But we see the regulation come through the written word. And those things are all customized to the nature of what your organization needs to have in place in order to understand clarity, right? So one of the major sticking points we end up with groups, not our concern, but groups who find frustration, are having all of these rules and regulations built out, but not actually reviewing them, right? I mean, a policy binder on a shelf that's collecting dust isn't doing a whole lot of good.
So Paul, to just add to that, and you're right, when people have roles and responsibilities, but when you're all working to the same vision and you have that shared understanding, oftentimes then it's not just a volunteer role, all of the legal part of it, the fiduciary duty, it takes care of itself when you're all working together. So having a strategic vision and building a team, I think, is really critical to getting people to do these tasks and to follow through when you're all pushing for the same thing. Another question, Paul, and I'll try not to bog you down, but should boards provide meeting notes to their memberships?
Well, it's actually a requirement within Societies Act legislation. Leslie, I am not totally clear on other legislative streams requirements around record, like access to records, like for condominium corporations and other groups who are outside of the Societies Act. In the Societies Act of Alberta, it is a requirement to address how records are made available to the membership, okay? A frequent question we do get asked is, should we make our bylaws available? Oh my goodness, people, yes. Anyone can go to a corporate registry office and pay a nominal fee and print off a copy of your last legally registered set of bylaws. So not having them on your website, not making them available when people ask, is a barrier, right? It's an unnecessary barrier. Now I say that as the precursor, because the question I think was about meeting minutes.
Yes.
Meeting minutes and that kind of record keeping is a part of your legal record. Okay, it's part of your public legal record, and everything that's a part of a nonprofit organization's public record that's not related to financials. Okay, bylaws, society annual returns, and your proof of filings, and your agendas, your meeting minutes, your special resolutions, if you do a major special resolution at a meeting, all of that's part of your public record. And in record retention for nonprofit compliance, you are required to keep those things for the entire lifetime of the association. The Canada Revenue Agency used to use the synonym of either 99 plus years and or lifetime. They've archived some of their literature around that, but to my knowledge, those rules have not changed. Public record is for life. Financials are, you can shred them on 7-year cycles according to the CRA's standards.
Excellent. Transparency. We would always say, you're a member-driven, if you're a member-driven organization, your members should know what's happening. So that's the number one reason to do it, regardless of what the legislation says. All legislation says members have a right to have access. So why would you put up a barrier? Yeah. Are we going to be discussing the roles of executive coming up, Paul?
Not in my 30 slides.
Okay.
No, like, so, I don't have president, vice president, like, no.
Okay, lots of time those are in people's bylaws. So I'll answer that question. We had another question, and really talking about conflict of interest, and you use the word ethics too, but there's conflict of interest, confidentiality, and code of conduct. We call them the 3 C's. Are you going to dive into those a little bit?
Yes, you're 5 slides ahead of me.
Okay, excellent. So I'm not going to ask this next question until you get there, and I'll come back. So when you see my unmute, pause for me, Paul.
Perfect. Great. So we'll continue. I will note for the facilitators, every now and then I get a little thing that pops up on my screen saying someone's in the waiting room. So I just wanted you to know that I'm seeing that. I don't know if people are being admitted. So moving forward, I've talked about delegation of tasks, dedication of resources. Another part of this is to source the professionals. You know what, at the end of the day, just volunteers, we're volunteers. We're doing our best, okay? And at the end of the day, we have the ability to bring in the people who have the expertise that we do not. This becomes, I put audit here in brackets because at least for Societies Act groups, it is not defined at a legislative level what entails an audit. We do know that there are reasons why you have obligation to not mismanage funds and not, sort of deal with things like audit in a haphazard way as we grow out the size and the scope of our organizational capacity. You are asked to provide audited financial statements, but there's this little star, not literally, this little kind of figurative star idea around the fact that that's not actually mandated in terms of the scope of what an audit entails. Organizations all across the province and all across the country really are engaging in responsible financial auditing practices, but just do know that, that small group who are brand new, who have 10 members and $400 in a bank account, are not being held to the same standard as other organizations. And so there are reasons and rules around why you would source professionals to bring in certain kinds of practices like that. A great example would be bookkeeping, right? Bookkeeping, somebody who has an understanding around how to produce monthly financial statements. If part of the board's obligation is to safeguard the association, then financial understanding and financial literacy becomes a really important thing around, are you making informed decisions around what's in the best interest for the organization? You understand your numbers, right? The Federation of Calgary Communities is a unique organization in offering training around financial literacy for people who are not accountants. And so we recommend that people sort of understand the scope of what it is that they've taken on, because at the end of the day, we need to know. We need to know.
Paula, just jump in. I'm going to make a comment. Someone has asked, do we need to file taxes? And the answer is every organization, if you're incorporated, needs to file federal taxes. At the bare minimum, a T2 if your assets are more than 200,000, a T1044 if you're just a not-for-profit. You also have to do an annual return to the Societies Act. So hopefully that answers the question. Direct message me if you want more information, whoever asked that question. Also on audit, our audits are required, but we can't afford them. 2 members are good. That's the Alberta Societies Act standard. That's the minimum requirement, 2 members. But think about that. 2 members who know nothing about financial literacy can sign off. So how reliable are your financials? So really put some thought in when you have 2 members doing that review. Make sure they know what they're doing and they have a process, because ultimately you're public organizations and you're accountable to the membership. As you get more and more funding, you do want to put some money aside to get a professional audit. It will help leverage other funders as well. The Federation does offer audit service for not-for-profit and charities. Sorry, Paul, back to you.
Leslie's helping me with this because she knows that math is my kryptonite. I understand compliance, but numbers, ooh, not my favorite. Sorry, I'm making fun of myself. So, I'm not going to read this, folks, but it's an oath. It's an oath for board members. It's a recap, really. And actually, I'll call on Phil here in a sec around my next poll. But basically, directors, should be able to say, you know what, I'm here for the right reasons. I'm making a concerted effort to stay on top of things. I understand that the interests of the organization come before my own reasoning as to what brought me forward and why I joined, and that there are ways of understanding the appropriateness in how we conduct ourselves as a team, how I conduct myself as an independent person, just on a personal level, and that we're all here for the cause, right? Phil, I was wondering if you could launch my next poll number 3 for me. I just want to check in, folks. So wondering, okay, how are you feeling? I know it's Saturday morning. We're using language like legal liability, fiduciary duties. Is this feeling okay, or is it heavy-handed? Sometimes we do get people who go, oh, dear Lord, what have I signed up for? And it's never my goal to say that or to like send that kind of message, right? I love this answer. Great. I feel like a volunteer boss. Okay, that's beautiful. For those who feel like a volunteer boss, let's remember that we're all in this together too, right? We're here to support the team and not necessarily feel like suddenly we have a right to bonk everything with a heavy stick. I wrote this poll, so I'm being cheeky. Okay, thank you, Phil. If we stop sharing, that would be great. I thought that was funny. So moving forward, all of this kind of comes down to this sort of idea that okay, fine. We can look at the language of unilateral liability. We can get into that sort of heavy legalese insurance talk around the fact that, we're unilaterally liable as a team, as a unit. But really what this comes down to is sort of the reality check, which I view as a positive, is that we're empowered to be a part of a team who may not always agree, have spaces for debate and carrying out decision-making practices, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together and we speak with one voice. So this is sort of that piece that comes back to what I was talking about earlier, that the best conversations are sometimes in the parking lot, right? But how do we as a board understand that, yes, there are mechanisms that allow us to gather, to carry business forward, to vote on things, to have hard conversations, to not always agree, to outright disagree, to hire that person and expand on that project that may or may not have been successful. At the end of the day, though, we represent the work of the association together, because together we are the ones who are driving this thing in the direction that it's going in. And so this is that sort of reality check. It's not necessarily about, oh no, what have I signed up for? And oh my goodness, this is kind of heavy language. It's actually, once we realize that we're all in this together for some very binding bottom line reasons, we can kind of move forward and just focus on the work that that we signed up for in the first place, because we have clarity, because we have understanding, and because we understand how we're going to move the work of the nonprofit forward in a way that everybody is clear on, and that we're not getting entangled in a lack of clarity. So I do have a slide that comes up later around common conflicts and things like that, some of the reasons that cause rubs as well. So the power, the importance to speak with one voice. This also comes back to that notion of being able to come before the membership and say, hey, it doesn't just have to be an AGM, but for the purposes of this example, let's use an AGM. It's the AGM. This is the kind of year we've had. This is how your board is representing that work. This is what we've been up to. And what does it feel like to speak with one voice? And I really like this principle, because it's the same for the person who's been involved for 10, 15 years as it is the person who's been there for, a month or just one term, right? Perhaps 1 year term. To speak with one voice. What does it feel like to be a part of that team and to understand the parameters around the board's need, necessity, but also importance to speak with one voice? So as you join your organizations, there are some things to sort of acclimate to. There's some things that are probably pretty important to figure out who's who in the zoo and how you have formed and function, or how you have formed and how you're structured, because there's all sorts of different kinds of ways that nonprofits figure out different entry points into their own organizational frameworks. The legislative stream you're incorporated under, again, I did say at the Federation, it's the significant majority of our groups are under Societies Act legislation. We do have some other condominium corporations. There are different legislative streams, but to understand, are you a nonprofit? Do you have charitable status with the CRA? What are some of the ins and outs around your bottom line requirements of your own incorporation status? What kind of board are you? This was something that many people asked questions about in preparation for today is, okay, are we a working board? Are we a governance board that is hands-on enough, or are we a governance board that is perhaps meddling in operational affairs when really we have a broader base of staff and people who've been designated all sorts of roles and responsibilities, and we're supposed to be ambassadors for the organization setting strategic directions, but people who are perhaps getting a little bit too involved in ways that could potentially be inappropriate, okay? I'm not saying that is inappropriate for a governance board, but there were people who had questions in advance of today around understanding their own model, okay? So this comes back to, welcome to the team. Have you had an orientation? Do you understand sort of that who's who in the zoo sort of organizational chart? So this is the middle piece here. Do you understand the scope of your board, the nature of the work that's been set forth for you? The things you've inherited from your past board that you have have been set into motion that you are now carrying forward, and the people who have been outsourced all around you in order to support, whether it's a couple of people or whether you are a multi-million-dollar arena with 15 staff and 100 seasonal people. I mean, our organizations come in all shapes and sizes. So it's important that you take a moment to understand how to sort of put all of this in context and understand your own organizational culture. The principles of your liability as the governance team remain the same, but the way that that plays out structurally is different for everybody in slightly different ways. Commonalities across the sector, but they still are particular to the organizational culture and structure at your own home base. Your own objects and your bylaws, your policies and your procedures, this is that question that came up earlier around, okay, we don't know about the fiduciary language, or maybe we did, we don't, I don't know. How do we have those conversations? We often see those things put into practice in written form in order to regulate how you form and function in order to understand healthy governance and healthy operational practices. And that idea of healthy governance and healthy operational practices at the sort of bylaw policy and procedure level is what speaks back to the fact that, yes, we're doing things okay, we're moving in the right direction. Our binder isn't sitting on a shelf collecting dust. We do understand what it is that's sort of directing us in terms of how we do our work. And then this sort of far right here, this is very much, I mean, things like job descriptions, committee terms of reference, we're still in the land of policy sort of here. I sort of put this on the far right because the larger we grow our organizations out, the more I find in our work with nonprofits, the more I find some of these things begin potentially to become neglected, okay? I once had a manager call me up concerned that she felt the new president was slowly squeezing her out of her role. She'd been there for 20 years. I asked the manager what employment agreement and what her contract was, and she couldn't find anything on paper. I mean, I'm not here to cast judgment, but she reached out to me saying, I don't know what my rights are. And she had nothing clearly in reference that she could find regarding a position that she had held for an incredibly long period of time. And she really, really struggled with that particular moment. So this is a board basics workshop. This isn't about that. But when it comes down to volunteers joining a board, something as maybe simple sounds judgmental. I don't mean to use the word simple, but something as commonly understood as, well, what would you do if this was your paid position? Well, I'd want a job description. I'd want clarity to the role that I've signed up for. Leslie spoke a little bit earlier about that question that came forward around specific roles of executives, especially for chairs or presidents, vice chairs, vice presidents, secretaries, treasurers. A lot of our groups have rudimentary fundamental basics on what those core executive or officer positions do at the bylaw level. Always helpful to have job descriptions for volunteers as well that can help you guide the work that you're doing. And we see a lot of this for groups in crisis. A lot of this get missed. Now, I'm biased. So full disclosure, the groups who call me up and say, I need help, aren't calling because they're having a great day. They're typically calling because they're specifically focused or they're specifically facing something that is causing them grief. So when I say I'm biased, I mean 3 out of 5 calls I'm taking aren't based on just curiosity and need and looking for resources. 3 out of 5 are probably facing some sort of real challenge, okay? And it's this sort of zone, this far right space where things are often neglected. Committee terms of reference, not really talking about them today, but in terms of reference for a group of volunteers who've come together to do something on behalf of designated board work. Terms of reference are your who, what, where, when, why, how the work gets carried out so that the committee's not necessarily just sitting around making it up as they go, but that there's something, again, at a policy level that helps clarify what that committee's role is and how the work is being carried forward. This is kind of philosophical, and I'll go past this fairly fast because I've already talked about it. But your objects, when you incorporate as a society, it would be good to know what they are, okay? When you form as a nonprofit, you have to stipulate what it is your purpose for being is. So your objects are your purpose for being. Nonprofits have registered objects. Organizations with additional charitable status with the Canada Revenue Agency also have charitable objects in accordance with charitable law, according to 4 very narrow categories. It's not 4 items, it's 4 categories. They're like pillars of charitable purposes under the Canada Revenue Agency that you are permitted to do your work in accordance with. We do get nonprofits who reach out who are like, hey, we can't issue tax receipts for donations. It would be, and the vast majority of grants out there are available for charities and not nonprofits without status. We'd like to become a charity. I bring this up because some of the questions about today were about charitable sort of parameters. I would recommend that you sort of think about whether or not that's something that you truly want to pursue, because everything that a nonprofit with charitable status is doing around your revenue streams, your programs and services, all of the revenues that you generate as a charity have to funnel back into the registered charitable objects that you have on file with the Canada Revenue Agency. Okay, so the reason for being for nonprofits that don't have charitable status, objects are usually really philosophical and broad. CRA, charitable obligations, become really, really focused, specified, and the work that you're doing has to funnel back in cyclically for those registered charitable objects with the CRA. It's a whole sticky world out there around charitable law, and I'm not going to expand on it further, okay? But you'll have my email at the end of this, and we can talk again about this if you need. Bylaws are structural and skeletal, rudimentary. How are you structured? How do you form and function? Policies become everything that you populate gaps with, but they can't be workarounds. Okay, so policies and procedures. Policies are the how, procedures are the, what do you specifically do to carry out this policy? Policies and procedures are a little bit more nimble. Okay, the board can amend them, the board can change them, the board can, switch them up as they need to, but that policy and procedure framework is what you use to augment your organizational framework in terms of how you carry out your work. There are policies and procedures at every sphere of work. I've seen governance-related policies and procedures around who we are as a governing team as it pertains to the bylaws. We've seen policies about how to write policy. I'm not being cheeky, I see that. I have another slide on more specificity around policies and procedures, but essentially they are there to populate the gaps, especially operational, because bylaws are not, it's not good to get into the operational nitty-gritty and weeds. At the bylaw level, bylaws are a statutory document. That means they're legally binding. Policies and procedures become the things that you develop in order to augment the work of your association. So I kind of think of it like a zipper. On the left, we've got, this is a statutory document. Okay, bylaws are legally binding. They're filed with the province of Alberta. Anyone can go to a corporate registry office, as I mentioned, and print off a copy. They are governance, they are structural, they are the foundation of your association. They're legally binding, and it would be good if they were not overwritten, okay? I don't say that as in you should have really basic bylaws full of potholes and plot holes. I'm not suggesting that, but there is kind of an A to Z around, especially what the Societies Act of Alberta requires is a checklist for bylaw standards. And so it's good to understand your bylaws because you are bound to them, okay? Governance is ethical and mistakes do happen. There are groups who sometimes don't realize that maybe we didn't know that bylaw 17B said what it said and whoopsie daisy, right? It happens. We see it happen all the time. At the end of the day, you do have a responsibility to know those rules because boards can actually be held accountable to their bylaws in a court of law. That sounds severe. It's usually at the 11th hour where something has escalated to that point where something can become that challenging, problematic, and legally fraught. But because it's a statutory document, we can't talk about a legal document with a lot of flexibility. However, I would sort of soften that a little bit and say that governance is, we do the best we can. We use the rules in front of us. We do our best not to breach these things, and we govern accordingly. So policies and procedures become the piece that expands on this work. It's really important to understand, though, how they tend to inform day-to-day decision-making. A lot of organizations that I have worked with tend to think of bylaws as more of a foundational, legal, structural, functional foundation piece to how the nonprofit works, and then think of policies and procedures around behavior, conduct, and operations. Okay, a lot of operational policy writing happening with our groups, but they kind of mirror each other. That's why I play with this idea of the zipper, is that they sort of come together. So where something at the bylaw level might speak to removal of a director, and we've seen very, very comprehensive pieces around bylaws that might really expand on this, perhaps less so on the other side of things, we would wonder if you have something like a code of conduct. Okay, what does it mean to come to this work in good faith, and how do we behave when we're here? This is a very frequent conversation that I have, and Leslie brought it up earlier, but I'll talk to you briefly about the 3 C's here. On the bylaw side, because a voting member can become a director, regardless of the criteria, everybody's bylaws will stipulate the criteria on how a voting member can join the board. There's often going to be, in most cases, a more comprehensive set of bylaws around, okay, well, what does behavioral issues get flagged like? What does removal from the board, even potential removal of membership if someone's doing something that's harmful to your association? What does disciplinary process look like? This tends to be one of the sort of nuts and bolts pieces that we see at the bylaw level. I brought up the fact that I'm biased because people don't call me up saying, hey, I'm having a wonderful time. People call because they need something. They're either looking for resources or guidance or information, or they're just engaged in an outright conflict. I have noticed over the years, by and large, that groups who find themselves in conflict-related scenarios are often missing one of these. A code of conduct, which sets out behavioral expectations, that we come to this work in good faith and that there are certain things that we simply will not tolerate. So it's a behavior piece. Conflict of interest, identifying the fact that if somebody from the organization either finds themselves in a situation where a conflict is flagged, potential personal interest is something that complicates the cleanliness of somebody's ability to vote in something. So I'm a roofer, and we're going to put, this wouldn't be in policy, I'm just using an example. I worked with a group a couple of months ago on this. I'm a roofer, and our facility needs a new roof, okay? And I know 2 of the companies out of 3 who put bids in. I may potentially be in a conflict based on personal relationships, okay? So that's one example. Another one might be nepotism, okay? What does it mean for 2 people who are related to be in board and staff position? Is there a conflict of interest there? I would suggest yes. Conflict of interest policy typically speaks to the idea that if a conflict is identified by a board member, that the board as a whole has a responsibility to respectfully honor that process by having a conversation and determining whether or not they deem a conflict truly is tangible without the person in that potential conflict of interest position being a part of the conversation. So a recusal process, right? Where somebody who is potentially wrapped up in that sort of entanglement, not being a part of a board vote on the matter. Now, when I brought this up earlier, I talked about real, tangible, pragmatic conflict of interest, that roofer example, or that staff board member relationship. There's always going to be conflicts out there, especially in networked nonprofit groups where we kind of come with our connections. These things happen. What's important is that the board has a point of reference that is discussed, minuted, decided upon, so that if the board is approached again about this at a later time, they can say, actually, we did have those parties remove themselves. We did have that conversation, and we did determine, X, Y, and Z in terms of where we stand on the matter.
Question. So the question really is about roles and responsibilities. So the board, a governance board or a hybrid board that takes care of the governance, and the management and operations in an executive director or senior staff hands. How do we manage that so the board doesn't get involved in the work of the staff?
I would designate authority to limit supervisory capacity. Is sort of how I'm following that conversation. So even like our own organization, right? We have a large board of people who designate Leslie's responsibility to have oversight over employees, and then the funneling system that I talked about earlier is the way that sorry, Leslie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but like,
No.
you know, Leslie then has responsibility over the staff and then reports our operational scope and the work that we're engaged in, set by board direction, back up to the board so that they understand how to monitor progresses and accomplishments and setbacks, and that Leslie becomes the conduit through which that communication channel carries forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in simple terms, I am the only staff person of our organization, even though we have 24 staff. I am the only staff person. So the board and clear delegation of authority. So I know exactly what I'm in charge of. So that's in a policy, but then we have this nice little matrix.
Yeah.
This is what the board does. This is what I do. So when we start tripping over each other, we can refer to that matrix of delegation. And so we're not lost in the policy. It's just really clear. But at the same time, we're generous towards each other. So, if in the board meeting we slip into operations, I might say to folks, that's an operational question, but happy to answer it. Because again, it's a partnership. It is not them and us. So executive director or board, or board and staff. It is a team that is trying to meet, we have a very high mission. We have strategic objectives, a goal that we're all trying to achieve. So it is a teamwork. It's a balance. What's important from an executive director point of view, I only take direction from one board member. And in my case, it's the president. Well, I have chairs of my committees and we work collaboratively. At the end of the day, the board directs me through the president if we're not in a board meeting getting direction. So very clear lines of sight. So there's no confusion. We're not sitting in, a board member's not trying to get me to do something to support his company or whatever. It is clearly documented. So really important. Paul, I know I want to give you a time check because I know you are so full of information and got lots of slides, but it's 10 to 12. So I think you got to hone in on what you really want to tell folks. And, I'll pop back in with more questions and Justin will wrap up.
Great. Thank you. What I'm going to do, I'm looking at my slides here. So much of this is a recap of things already talked about. So what I'm going to do is just show the slide, remind the recap, and then get to the last three because they're quite lovely. I want to look at them. So I'll just kind of motor through here. These are the pieces we call the 3 C's. That's not a science, folks. Just code of conduct, conflict of interest, confidentiality. So many groups missing these kinds of pieces. Again, biased those who are facing a conflict scenario. So we do recommend that you understand sort of what you have in writing that helps guide decision-making processes and behavioral conduct. All of this has sort of been talked about, but bylaws, best practices, even policies and procedures are things that we should be reviewing as frequently as possible with orientation. Look, sometimes the rules are in place for 10 years, and that's great. But if I'm new to the team and I've only been around a month, how is it that I'm aware of the responsibility that I've taken on as well? I did make mention that policies and procedures are things that are more nimble, right? That things that the board can develop as we go so that we understand how we're augmenting the structural foundation of our bylaws and not trying to create workarounds is a really kind of key piece. I talked about this already, but I did want to promote this as a resource. So the Federation of Calgary Communities has a resource library, and you all have the password community. Everybody can use the same password community. There's a section under governance for volunteers around job descriptions and enormous amounts of information options for you. The job descriptions aren't overly complicated, right? But they can help become that clarification piece in order for you to understand maybe some of the different pieces that could help clarify roles and responsibilities so that we're not, again, making it up in the dark. There's also an expansive section under employment as well. So if you're new to your board and you realize that HR is something you need to work on, this is a great resource center for you. Meeting management is quite simple if we think about the red triangle. right? Meetings, 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 meetings. We all go to them. Whether your board is meeting I'm doing a bylaw review with an organization who are proposing to meet 6 months a year. We've got groups who meet every month of the year, upwards of 12 meetings. At the end of the day, meetings need to have purpose, but it comes back to that duty of care and being prudent and thorough. Is the board able to effectively understand oversight of the work of the organization if maybe there isn't a piece in place that helps with the continuity of responsible oversight? So when it comes to meeting management, this really comes about, and in some ways the president or the executive sort of responsibility in understanding how to help everybody feel like meetings are that space to share information, to, vote on business, participate in decision-making practices, but that it takes leadership to cultivate that. So really important to kind of remember the value and the importance of why meet, right? If you don't have reason, perhaps don't. Do be aware of what the bylaws stipulate your requirement for meetings are. But at the end of the day, this is about being productive and efficient with your time and not just feeling like you need to be bogged down with unnecessary structures. Agendas are I've got a slide for you on agendas and minutes. I'll work pretty quickly because of the interest of time. Agendas are about, the business specifically that you're here to discuss. I did make that note about public record being required for the lifetime of your association. So do be aware of what kind of goes into these documents and the importance of record retention. We've talked about that idea of, informed decision-making practice. So that's why we have rules around how much time do I need? If we're having a sensitive conversation at next month's meeting, maybe seeing the agenda the night before isn't a great way for me to understand what it is that I'm about to engage in. It's okay to carry the business forward. Don't beat yourselves up. And one thing that I wanted to kind of note around membership meetings, so annual general meetings or special meetings that you may have out of rotation, meetings of the membership, the agendas are restricted by virtue of the fact that you need to, all of the members out there who were served notice of the meeting have the right to know what was going to transpire. So you can't tweak the agendas once the meeting is called in that moment, by virtue of the fact that there may have been people out there in the community that would have come if they had known that you've just added item 5 to the agenda, okay? So this idea of the restricted agenda kind of becomes important. Meeting minutes are meant to include and note what transpired, but actually it's this third piece here that I find the most interesting. Brief details, folks. Meeting minutes are public record, again, required to keep them for the lifetime of the association. We once had an association with neighbors fighting with neighbors, and they demanded that their personal residential relationship fight be minuted. Oh my goodness, no. Minutes are there to record the outcomes of the business decisions with enough context to understand how the association's work is captured. Action items that carry forward help hold people accountable. And also kind of important to consider how they're authenticated, okay? So what does, you're required to keep minutes for the lifetime of the association. So how do you verify especially if we're shifting over to digital record keeping more and more often, more and more frequently, how do you verify that these are actually the minutes as presented to the membership and a part of your record retention? All of this is fairly self-explanatory and on the slides, so feel free to just email me, and I'm more than happy to have conversation with you about the nuts and bolts around meeting management. Common word meeting challenges, there's just a few slides here that are very quick, but I wanted to just sort of note, these are the things that people tend to call us about. Oh no, high board turnover or a lack of understanding around roles and responsibilities, or communications are entangled or personal or heightened. We've done a lot of work with a nonprofit organization called Community Mediation Calgary Society, so CMCS. And one of the things that we talk a lot about with CMCS is that conflict's never the problem. People tend to realize when they end up in a conflict that there's something else going on here, but so many folks tend to blame the conflict as the problem. But the conflict itself is actually a symptom. It's about lack of clarity based on different ways of doing, based on misinterpretation or distrust, which turns into confrontation, right? But when people are struggling around assumptions or reactive behavior or avoidance or attacking character or dismissiveness, or text messages that aren't appropriate in contrast with what was shared on email, or just outright gossip. These are the kinds of things that are not necessarily a part of the fact that you've joined the team, you're here together, you speak with one voice. How do we understand how to sort of mitigate these things from the onset rather than allowing them to escalate to a point of no return, I guess is a situation we see.
Paul, I'm going to jump in. I have an excellent question about, should we be getting directors to sign off on all agreements? We're out of time, so this will be your final question, and we'll have to wrap up. So what do you say, Paul? Confidentiality, conflict of interest, code of conduct?
Yes, everybody sign off on all of it. No, it's you know what, folks, we've also seen people propose policy that then alienates the team because they feel targeted. We've actually seen a board half walk out because somebody who felt that they were a part of a conflict brought forward a policy saying we all have to get along here, and that alienated folks. Now, in some ways that may have been impossible to mitigate. Maybe that was an inevitable outcome of the personalities around that table. But what I would encourage you to do is to understand that if you're all in this together, you need to be doing this work together. And if you're doing this work together, how do you have those conversations?
And Paul, that's the key here. It's about creating the culture and doing this work before you are in a crisis, before it's needed, and it becomes part of what the organization's about. I'll give you the final word, Paul. 11:59.
Three slides in 30 seconds.
Okay.
We did it. No, for real. I can just do this.
Go.
We did a really interesting research project with United Way called Grow Your Community Hub. And what I wanted to share with you is the data around why people join, what brings them in, right? 15, and the largest here, 15, 25, and 30. 15% was about relationship, where people felt they were valued on an interpersonal level. 25% felt that they could see themselves in the vibrancy of the work, that it wasn't just sort of a one-trick pony kind of organization. But the largest and perhaps most surprising response was that people felt that they could see, that people felt both personal and professionally recognized in the communications, that communications were open and that they could therefore contribute in active and dynamic ways. So I wanted to sort of leave this with you because the idea of belonging is so central to how we build positive nonprofit cultures. Everybody has a slide as a takeaway around considering what you may want to stop or start or change. Not that you have to do one or the other, but just ways to reflect on this. And at any point in time, feel free to send me an email or a phone call. I'm here to help. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I'll turn it back over to the team.
Thank you so much, Paul. Great information. Again, thank you everyone for just, kind of riding the train with us today. Paul, is it okay if you also put that in the chat, like the link, so people can copy and paste? I will be sending out information on Paul's slides shortly here as well. So you will have, all of the information that Paul shared today. And again, he has his email there to connect with him. Just 30 seconds here. Forgive us for being a minute over here. We're going to put the evaluation in the link. Let us know this information was helpful. Of course, a lot of this information helps guide our work as a committee to what you want to see with future webinars. So I know Phil will just put that in the chat. And you'll also get the email. So if you don't get to right now, that's okay. I do want to plug our next Board Leadership Calgary event, which is 2 weeks from now, Saturday as well, 10:30 November 19th, specifically on fund development that's built to fit. So again, we look at all of these as a really basic understanding around your role in board governance, as volunteers, as staff, and so on. So please join us. There's still some seats available as well in 2 weeks. I mean, if you found this webinar, you probably have seen the link to the other ones coming up here. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody.